Okay. Thank you everyone for coming. This has been really great. This has been a great workshop so far, and it'll be exciting to talk and hear from all of you after this about your thoughts, what you think is needed in the community. And I'm going to present a bit of my opinion on that here, and the work effort of a ton of people not listed here, which I realized this morning. A lot of people in the room and some people that aren't here. I sent out by email a preprint of the manuscript that essentially I'm going to present to you today. And this was started, I think, Ari, you talked a little bit about this at the beginning of the workshop. We had a workshop, what?
2023.
3 years ago, and it only took us that long to put this together. And actually part of that was because of how long it took to do this. And so this is a comparison between a bunch of different models, some of which you saw earlier today. And I have to put up this slide often when I talk about volcanic gases. This is a photo from Hawaii, which is, Volcano Observatory has been making these measurements for like over 100 years. They've been making volcanic gas measurements. And yeah, everyone should read Mark Twain. It'll enrich your lives. It's kind of amazing to me as someone who's, Volcano Observatory adjacent, an admirer of volcano observatories, from the position of someone who's done some volcanic measurements in the field and done a lot of lab work and modeling, and looking at this disconnect between the tools that we're creating and the really academic work that we're doing in the ivory tower, which is really true and it really is in a bubble, and then what the volcano observatories want and need, or at least what their mission is. I mean to speak for the people who actually run these places. But having been to a number of them and seeing the kinds of resources they have and having some understanding of the restrictions that they have, you all saw how difficult it can be to run some of these models. I'm sure most of you know this from experience. Taking someone who's in an operational setting and asking them to try to deep dive into this world of fugacity coefficients and KEQ values and what's matched with what calibration data sets is just not feasible. And so a lot of these volcano observatories have for a long time, as Ari showed, measured volcanic gases either in situ with a glass bottle on a stick, or with these multi-gas sensors. A lot of them have telemetered near real-time measurements, but they're not really used in an operational setting very often. These aren't things that are easily integratable into automated workflows for volcanic forecasting and hazard mitigation. So we're at the point where we have so much geochemical data, so many experiments that we've been doing for decades and decades. And we are at the point where we can take that information and turn it into something that's a better usable tool. I probably don't have to highlight here why that's difficult logistically from an academic perspective. It's work that's not rewarded. It's work that's often actively discouraged. If you're someone who's a tenure track person who's not yet tenured, you might have colleagues that tell you, and rightfully so, this is a waste of your time. If you're spending time to do extra things like put together a read the docs page that you can't cite separately from your manuscript. So that's a problem that I'm not going to be able to solve, but I think highlighting the need for these things, everyone agrees there's a need for these things. Let's start talking about how to actually actualize that. So what is the point of this exercise that we've done to compare all these models? First is to address, like I said, this vast, confusing landscape of models. There's so many, they run in different ways, they take different inputs, they make different assumptions. Even amongst us model authors and model users for this manuscript, it took us 3 years. A lot of that was more than a year, actually throughout the whole process, talking to each other to understand that, make sure we were actually modeling the same things. So that's saying something. As I mentioned, there's implications for places like volcano observatories. And I want to stress here that the point of this is not to say which one does better at Hawaii, which one does better at Nyiragongo. It's not to say which is more correct. It's to look at the divergence and understand why they differ, which is a task in and of itself, and then maybe make some recommendations for the community. How do we move forward from here? So the modeling landscape has evolved over time, and it's still quite varied. All of these forms of using a model still exist, from graphical user interfaces to an equation in a paper to volatile calc. Who's never seen this before? No one. Everyone's used it. Wait, one person? One person hasn't seen it. You have to enable Visual Basic macros. Anyway, so now we have this, right? But as our earlier speaker sort of noted, now it's sort of like this. So yeah, we have a lot of these tools, and a lot of them are being modernized, but it's still like this cascade of things that you have to figure out how to run. And through this next slide, I just want to let the model authors know they did not know that I was assigning them emojis. And they have no bearing on the rest of the talk, but I liked the way this slide looked rather than a list. So these are the emojis that you get. They make sense to me. Because it uses a dual KD, uses a two partition coefficient system that intertwines, which I think is actually genius. If you guys haven't read Echo's paper on Sulfur X, it's worth reading it, not just using the model. But see? Volphi is a treasure chest of internal mechanisms. So what does our data pipeline typically look like? And this is an example with gases, but this could be for any data that you have, right? We take our measurements, we process our data. Also, please never use rainbow. If you need to know why, talk to me after class. Never use rainbow. And then we can calculate some compositions from it. Maybe that's even a simple calculation. And then we model it. And so we format our data separately for each model that we want to input it into, and then we do some modeling and hope that it's all consistent, and then try to make sense of this mess. So one of the things that we love to do, right, is have this pipeline that all these models have a common language. I've heard people using that a lot today, a common language between models, which they don't have now, even if they're all in Python. So this is us. And so what we decided to do was look at one particular type of modeling scenario, and that's calculating degassing paths for 4 basaltic systems. I'll show you what those look like in a second. Basically, what you're going to be looking at here is plots that look something like this, where we have pressure on the x-axis and whatever dependent variable on the y, and pressure is going up to the right. And then whatever dependent variable. So when you're degassing, you're starting at some pressure saturation. Pressure saturation is what we chose to start our models at. That's that dot here. And then the evolution towards the surface is going like this, towards the origin. So all of the models, and so like I said earlier, we're talking about VesiCal, this calculation takes into account a lot of these compounded steps. So starting with that saturation pressure, and then each step along that degassing curve is sort of another compounded piece of model uncertainties between the different models. So these are the basaltic systems that we chose. So we have mid-ocean ridge basalts. We have Kilauea volcano, it's our volatile pore OIB. We have Fuego volcano, it's our arc, and Fogo volcano, which is our volatile rich OIB, OIB, ocean island basalt. And so here are just sort of we tried to choose an array of different characteristics of the different magmas. There's others too, obviously alkalis is a big one. So we have a range of water, CO2, S constants, and ratios therein, temperatures, and oxygen fugacities, which, look, I showed this figure to a friend, she's like, look at that sulfur trend. The x-axis has no meaning. These are it's just a comparison table. So I'm gonna dive right in with some results. So the first thing that everyone's model does, again, the x-axis has no meaning. What you're looking at is just the saturation pressure on the y-axis, and then each of those points represents a different model. So again, the models that we were running are these guys, and I can talk about how they sort of intertwine in a bit. So each one of those symbols is a different model. The white and black, the X, white square, and the star are all VesiCal, so those are water only, water CO2 only, H2O only. And the others all have sulfur in them. So you're seeing more Kilauea, Fuego, Fogo, and like all of our plots will look something like this. So let's talk about various things that we learned from taking apart these data. So in no particular order, let's talk about the effect of sulfur. So in this asterisk on everything I'm about to say is in the systems that we examined here. And I know you had I think it was you and I that talked a bit about how that can change in other systems. So I've just thrown up this this table here, just if you wanted to be reminded of the volatile concentrations in these guys. And what I've done here is, so each of these sulfur models, again, everything, all of the colorful ones have sulfur in them, but all of them consider an H2O CO2 first. And so like, Echo, you're talking about your model uses Giacomo-Marciano or volatile calc, calculates that pressure, and then it runs the degassing paths. And so a lot of these models do the same kind of a thing, but some of them use sulfur in that calculation, HCNS, and some just use H2O CO2, like Echo's model. And so let's see if you can see my asterisks, not really. So there's an asterisk on sulfur X and one on Vasakel. Those are the ones that use only H2O CO2, and the others use sulfur. And so what I've highlighted here are only the models that use Giacomo-Marciano under the hood. So this is the pure Giacomo-Marciano model as coded in Vasakel. And then sulfur X should be essentially the same. It's just the Giacomo-Marciano model. And then decompress using Giacomo-Marciano, magic using Giacomo-Marciano, also consider sulfur. So we have a nice one-to-one comparison in a sense, as insofar as you can get. And one thing we saw with these is that they're remarkably consistent, right? So if you look at, for example, these here under Kilauea, this one has sulfur, this one doesn't, this one does, and this one doesn't. And same thing for here, sulfur. Oh, yeah, look, I've helpfully color-coded them. Sulfur, no sulfur, sulfur, no sulfur. And there's some differences, like this one, but Magic also has an interesting coupling mechanism they do with sulfur. So basically what we have determined from this is that for these systems, there is no effect of sulfur on the pressure of vapor saturation in these magmas. And that's been an interesting question. I've seen a lot of times in the literature, we ran this and then we ran that.
There's still sulfur that's partitioned into the vapor.
That's true, yeah.
It's not governing the saturation.
Yeah, this is a great point. So Terry mentioned that there's a small amount of sulfur partitioned into the vapor at these pressures. The pressure of vapor saturation is obviously the higher pressures. And as we've seen earlier, the sulfur degassing doesn't happen until much later. So with some caveats, this probably applies to most systems. So that's kind of interesting. The next thing I want to talk to you about is these value ranges, and a reminder that we're not saying any one of these models is better. Interestingly, it looks like Fuego and Fogo disagree more than Morb and Kilauea. Not really true. It's sort of it's a trick because of the y-axis being scaled the same for each of them. Percentage-wise, it's pretty much the same. It's about 1.7 times difference between the minimum and the maximum, which first of all is significant. So that's showing us that there is significant variation just in this. But also, it just strikes me that for all models, or for all systems rather, it's about 1.7. It's like 1.69 and 1.68. And so what we can then think about what this means, these ranges for, okay, what are we going to do with that in an actual setting? We can convert these to depths. And now it's tricky because when we want to convert this pressure to a depth, we need to know the density of the crust that it's sitting underneath, right? So we know how much weight is on top of it. And so we've done a simple calculation where we have a two-step model for like a hydrostatic two-step model to figure out what the depth would be for those pressures, where we take 2 layers for each volcano, except for Kilauea, and have 2 different densities for each of those layers. So for Morb, you have the ocean of 2.75 kilometers of 1 gram per cubic centimeter, and then basaltic crust 2.9 grams per cubic centimeter. And all of these are sourced from like gravity and geophysical data. And so this again is just basically reflective, right, of these ranges. They look kind of familiar, but upside down. And so you can, it's again, 1.7x is basically the difference that you're seeing. But these are the sort of ranges that we're getting. And this is the depth here. For example, Fuego, about 15 kilometers to 25 kilometers would be where we think that magma is sitting. So depending on what model you're using, that you could interpret that very differently. Again, none of these are implying model correctness. And I want to show a nice example of that by looking at FOGO. So these are the results from FOGO. And then immediately you might want to say, look at how different, particularly EVO, which is this orange one, and decompress, the blue circle. Look how different they are, right, from all the rest. And this dashed line is the median. And these actually agree to within some very small percentage in terms of if you were to assign an error on these. But we were trying to figure out, well, why do they disagree so much? So EVO, the underlying H2O/CO2 model that it uses is the one of decompress. And then I also want to call your attention to the vesical volatile calc. This is X. That's the underlying H2O/CO2 model it uses. So let's take a look at the data used to calibrate these models. This will become clearer in a second, because you can kind of see, right, that we have sort of three groups of pressures. So again, the decompressed ones, the volatile calc one, and then the Iacono-Marziano one, and Volfi. She sits right in there too. We're going to talk about the other ones. And magmas, just hanging out in there. Okay, so if we want to look at how these apply to our models, to our model parameterizations and the magma compositions, these are the different volcanoes, and I've circled this one, so that's Fogo, more Kilauea Fuego, and so this is where they sit on a TAS diagram. And these are, I've just like vaguely circled the sort of convex hull of experimental compositions used to calibrate these. And so this is Iacono-Marziano in the pink. This is the Dixon model in the dark blue. And this is the decompress model that both EVO and decompress are using. And we were looking at the data sets, and it's one of these things where people always ask, which is the best model for my situation? Sometimes it's the most generic one that covers the most space. Sometimes it's the most narrow one that's closest to your composition. Penny does a great job in Vesical Part 2 about talking about how this applies to the Dixon model. But in this case, we're seeing that the decompress experimental data set and the volatile calc one are selecting for more alkali-rich and silica-poor magmas, which Fogo very much is. And it's one that we don't have a lot of experiments in this part of the TAS diagram. And so, I don't know the answer, but is it that these are biasing, the rest of this model? Should they be separated more? Should we be thinking about how we're handling these different areas internally? It's a question, I think, for all of us about how general do we want the models to be, or how can we actually do that in a way that we're not sort of undercutting ourselves. So again, none of these are more correct, but it would be easy to say that those top three were outliers. But in fact, maybe they're better calibrated for the system. So let's talk about oh gosh, I'm sorry, it's so blurry. Let's talk about the melt volatile contents. Hopefully that gets better slightly for these systems. So this is the water on the top, CO2 and sulfur degassing, so the concentration in the melt. And what's interesting to look at here is the relative depths of degassing of the different volatiles. So here I've just highlighted more so you can actually see them. And you'll notice that the x-axis is scaled to the point where we start to see appreciable degassing. And so from CO2, it's degassing just linearly throughout. That's sort of the canonical behavior. H2O also waiting till it gets much lower, and then degassing later along with sulfur. But if you want to talk about the depth of degassing, even though, for example, they're sort of similar trends, the depth at which we start degassing for all of these models is way down here, where the depth for the other models even starts a little bit here, appreciable here, a little bit here, and starts to be really appreciable there. So if you're thinking about applying these to a natural volcanic system, that's going to change your interpretations. We can also look at the redox sensitive variables, including redox. So here we've plotted, again, more Kilauea Fuego Fogo. degassing from right to left, the redox state in terms of log FO2 relative to the F&Q buffer, the iron 3 plus to total iron ratio, and then the sulfur redox, the S6 plus to S total ratio. And this is perhaps unsurprisingly where the models diverge the most. And one thing I'll call your attention to is that the initial conditions of, I don't know where my mouse is. There it is. The initial conditions in terms of redox are different. And we prescribed the same conditions for all of the models to run these calculations at. And what we discovered is that this has to do with internal representations of redox. This is a famous pain point among spectrologists. How do you talk about redox? Are we using log FO2 or Fe3 plus the total iron? And are we converting between the two? Are we using, who's here has used Kress and Carmichael in 1991? Everyone's favorite. I probably don't remember whether you used equation 7 from the main text or the equations from the appendix. Different models use different ones. We discovered this partway into our Zoom chats talking about this, and everybody's like, oh, well, you guys are probably using equation 7. I used the appendix. There are two? So things that, we didn't realize. People need to know about these assumptions that are being made. They can have big effects. Another thing is the sulfur reaction mechanism. And so we go into some detail in the manuscript about how to try and back out what these relationships between the melt vapor equilibria, what they actually are in these models based on their outputs. And one thing that does a really good job of illustrating this point is the decompressed sulfur model. It assumes that the melt species are SO2 and H2S, so actually molecules of those in the melt in addition to in the vapor, and then link the fugacity to the activity. But we know that from measurements that the sulfur isn't bonded that way in the melt. And it's also neglecting the intermediate redox states of sulfur. So all the other models model it that way. And that is probably why you're seeing this blue curve here. I apologize, that's so blurry. The blue curve here is completely different from all of the others. It's way more oxidizing than all of the others. And that's decompressed. So that's probably why that's happening. And then the depth of degassing is having this huge effect. So Terry highlighted the point that we're not getting much sulfur into the vapor when we're super deep. But as soon as we start exsolving H2O and CO2, we see a huge amount of divergence. So I've just thrown some dashed lines. These are not meaningful numbers. This is by my eye, just to illustrate the point in this talk of where we see the depth of degassing based on the previous plots, and then how they match up with where these models start to diverge, right? So here in FOGO, they're still not great, but at least they're sort of linear, and then they go in completely opposite directions once you start exsolving sulfur. And then the ultimate result of these models is the vapor composition at the surface. So again, connecting it to those measurements that are being taken at the surface. And these are in more Kilauea Fuego FOGO, and showing, I don't know where my mouse is, I apologize. Showing the evolution of, this is the carbon over sulfur ratio, again, degassing from right to left. And this is the log SO2 over H2S ratio, and degassing from right to left. And I mean, I don't even need to go into detail, right, for you to see how wildly different these are. And this is from, that's one right there on the right-hand side of the plot. That means that's the pressure of vapor saturation. So immediately, some of them are off the chart. We couldn't even plot them together in the same axes. And then what we've plotted here next to that in the bar chart is the overall cumulative composition of the gas at one bar, essentially, for each of the systems for each of the models. And so these are each model along this x-axis, and then the proportion of each of these species in the gas phase, and where they vary most. And it's, of course, maybe unexpectedly, the sulfur species are really seeing a huge variance. And the more water poor systems, that water, like in Fuego, is sort of swamping everything, right? Because most of our vapor is water. So in these volatile poor systems, you can really see how divergent these are. And even H2S SO2 ratios is one of the things you're going to use to think about depth of degassing, for example. So let's talk a little bit, this is the only equation, I promise. Let's talk a little bit about the thermodynamics. So underlying all of these models is this nested web of assumptions and sub-models. And so Airy came up with a really nice way to think about backing out the solubility relationships, the melt-vapor equilibrium relationships, based on model outputs only. So not having to understand the choices, simply interrogating the results from a thermodynamic standpoint. And so we have this proportionality factor, and that's this H prime variable. And it's something that's akin to an equilibrium constant, a solubility limit, a capacity, right, like sulfur capacity at sulfide saturation kind of a thing. And so it's a function of pressure, temperature, and the system composition. And it also intrinsically includes any fugacity coefficients that people have used. So that's describing how ideal or non-ideal the gas is, and whether adding more components to the gas affects the solubility of the others, things like that. So we can even back out things like that. And basically what you're looking at is the proportionality factor, and you can look at the weight fraction of the species in the melt, and then this is the mole fraction of the species in the vapor, and then some FO2 term to describe that redox equilibrium. And when you do that, you can define this sort of solubility, right, proportionality factor, basically just relative differences in these models, these tools, for various species. So this is H2O, CO2, reduced sulfur, and oxidized sulfur. And in general, let's look at the H2O, CO2 first. You can kind of see that they fall into one of three groups, which is similar to what we saw before, talking about the vapor saturation pressure, where we have models using decompress, models using Iacono-Marziano, and Wolfi. Wolfi's just hanging out, doing its own thing. And then this blue dashed line is decompress, but using the Iacono-Marziano rather than its in-house model. And so that's the main driver of the calculated pressure of vapor saturation, which is, it's interesting to see how closely that actually matches to what inferences we were drawing from before. Now, the sulfur proportionality factors are just intrinsically more complicated than H2O and CO2, so they're not really a measure of the solubility as closely as the H2O and CO2 ones are, but really showing variability in the tool level behaviors. This is a thermodynamic view at what the differences in the model outputs are. You can sort of think of it that way. And so it's iron redox conversions, like I mentioned before, those are going to play a factor. The sulfur redox conversions, the sulfur redox models, which there are each one of these has its own sulfur model built on top of an H2O CO2 model. So therein all these differences compound. So not only the implementation of a model, but the factors chosen in the new model that was coupled to it. So with all of that said, we tried to come up with some recommendations for the community based on what we learned doing this exercise. So in our tips for users, right, which model should I use is the question. And things that you should be sure are appropriate are the reactions that are in the system you care about. So we've highlighted the fact that decompress assumes different species in the melt that have been shown, since that publication to not be the species that are actually in the melt. And was it you earlier, Penny, that was talking about this this difference that you would get because if everyone's using the decompressed model for Kilauea melt inclusions, you're going to see one type of behavior when all the other models show a different type of behavior that actually match these data, the natural data better. And so there's like a really tangible disconnect between like a volcano observatory setting and this academic side that need to come together to realize these things. The calibration data set that like I showed you an example from this earlier, if it includes your composition, or if you can trust that your composition is within the calibration space of that particular model, and you can do a sanity check on results of the model. So you can take a system that's like similar to your own. Let's say you wanted to look at FOGO and you found some of Penny King's experiments that she performed on really alkali-rich basaltic magmas, and you could plug those ones in, because now you know the conditions, you know the pressure and temperature. Plug those into the model you want to run and see if they match the results at all. And if they do, then there's a way for you to say to the readers and the reviewers of your paper that here's why we chose this model, because it produced sensible results for a similar system. And finally, follow FAIR guidelines. So it's findable, accessible, interoperable, and reproducible data. So citing the tool and the submodels. And we understand that this is tough to do because there's a lot there that you might not even know. So we've provided a template in the supplement of the manuscript as an example of how you might cite one of these models and all of the choices that you've used within that model. But then we also have tips for tool authors, because a lot of us learn things doing this in ways that we could make our own tools better. One thing is documentation. And again, this is one of these things that's not rewarded by the academic system, but it's really, really critical if we want to improve the landscape of models. So doc strings in code, that's after every time you define a function, you explain at the top, in triple quotes in English, what each input is, the units that are there, what the output is, what the type is. And that will allow someone later, including future you, to remember what format you have to put in data into your functions. Put your stuff in accepted repositories. The university one is fine. GitHub is common. GitLab is common. But it should be in a community accepted and long-lasting repository where people can access it. And it should be open source. Supply a README or read the docs, but at minimum have a README file that lives with those files. So if you publish it as a supplement, you also have it on a repo, great. In both places, have a README that's like a stamp from the time you publish, right? Saying, here's a minimum working example of how to run a calculation with this code. And also have clear versioning. So every time you do an update, if it's a bug fix, so you have, the canonical way to do this is like 1.2.5, right? 1 is the main version, the first release. 0.2 means there's been 2 features. Each time you add a feature, you add an increment to that second one. And every time you fix a bug, you increment the third one. So 1.2 and 0.5. It should be clear what you did between each of these versions, and you should version them in the code. So for those of you that are coders, when you write your code, if you're writing Python code, in your init file, __version __equals, and you put it in there, and now I can type your model.version and see it like we did in those notebooks. Also doing something like Zenodo or somewhere where you can take a snapshot, a static snapshot of the code that you used for the paper. Because if I want to go reproduce your results and I don't know what day that you access your GitHub repository to run those calculations, I can't reproduce them. But if you give me those files in like a zip file, I can pull them and rerun them. And libraries over scripts. So we're writing a script to do calculations when they're simple is totally fine. But if you're creating a tool for the community, making a library, and that means making discrete functions, not one .py file with your entire workflow in it, becomes really difficult to debug. It becomes really difficult to tell what users are doing different. If your Crescent-Carmichael equation is buried in the middle of 1,000 lines of code, you could pull it out and give it its own function name, and now I can run that, I can run mine, and we can immediately see the results. So again, that allows extensibility, allows people to build on your codes. I just want your Crescent-Carmichael thing. I'm going to plug it into my code. And it enables easier benchmarking, so it would help us to find more of these little hidden discrepancies. And validity limits, so for tool authors, but also for experimentalists and people who are doing measurements. A clear definition of the calibration database for the modelers, and a clear definition if you're putting out an empirical model of what parameter space that you think that covers. And assessing uncertainties, so you can do an approach like Volfi does, where you perform a Monte Carlo approach to see how errors change as you change all these inputs little by little, or calculate compounded errors as you run through every calculation. That's what decompress does. And finally, you kind of want to argue for a set of community standards and governance. And again, this is something that's hard to do, given that we're all already volunteering our time for so many things. If we could get funding for it, we would all do it. But it still is worth saying that having a community that has leadership that is official and codified, and we've seen some of this coming up in different respects, right? We saw Victor today, that was excellent. But having a community that would have requirements for publication. People probably reject papers for different reasons, and or say, major revisions. Like I would object to a paper being published and have, if they don't supply their data set. I know that sounds crazy, but they published it anyway, even though I told them I thought that wasn't good enough, right? Some people will say you need to have this kind of documentation for your code, and others might not. And there's a happy medium there. You can't expect everyone to do everything. But if we could come up with some reasonable, simple, small standards, then as reviewers, you could say, hey, they didn't follow these best practices, right? Like a code of conduct and contribution guidelines for each of these codes. So it's like, if I want to edit thermobar, how do I do that? How do I do a pull request? Do I call you? Do I send you a carrier pigeon? What is your preferred method? And so some key takeaways from all of this is the last conclusions bulleted list from our paper, and I'm just going to put them up here and as they are. So again, improved community consensus on the implementation of redox variables. FO2, iron redox, S redox, the equations we use to calculate buffers, and that's going to be critical for us to interpret these things, particularly sulfur. Targeted experiments. So this is one thing I was very happy to be able to try and preach about, is that we're always talking about filling the gaps, right? Filling the gaps. We need more water solubility experiments on Mount Shasta. Do we? Maybe. But I need to be convinced of that, right? Because we have, and I'm an experimentalist, so me saying we don't need more experiments is like, take that for what it is. I think that doing some exercise like this, we're able to say that these silica-poor alkali-rich basalts like Fogo, if we had more experiments on those and or could source more that maybe aren't already implemented, that would probably significantly improve the model agreement for those, because that's where our models disagree the most. So rather than just saying filling the gaps, using a informed approach, saying we've done this work to interrogate the actual data sets and the model outputs, here's where they fall down. And the fact that sulfur has little to no effect on the calculation of the pressure of vapor saturation is an important one to know. And again, just community governance is critical to creating these agreed upon standards, and that includes modeling, coding, and publishing in volcanology. I'm also gonna, again, plug once again that manuscript that this talk is based on. The preprint is now out there. We've just submitted it to Volcanica. So there is a link there to the preprint and also the GitHub. And I've emailed out that to the group as well. And just very briefly, I wasn't sure if I wanted to do this because it's new and I'm like, don't look at my bad code. But I want to talk about this, which we decided not to include in the manuscript. It's a library called Volcatinate, which I thought was pretty clever. One person, thank you. And the idea was to try and run all of our models at the same time. And this was like, we had an original line in the paper that was like, creating such a thing is well outside of the scope of this manuscript. And it turned out that, yeah, if we want to get it published, it is. But we have something working. I'm not recommending that you all go out and use it, but I think it's a good place to start. And one of the things I want to highlight is this idea of reproducibility. So you saw all the different configurations that each of these models has. And so there's two things that I implemented in this code to entangle those. One is a configuration file, is a sort of modeled after Evo's method of setting all those variables. So there is a YAML file, it's like a plain text file, where you, for every single model, you can put in what option you want, and they're all there. And there's a read the talks right now that's very long and wordy, but shows every one of those options. And also something called run bundles, that I decided to call this. So I wanted to be able to take a run that I did and then like give it to Ari and then give it to Echo and then give it to Penny and say, hey, do the same run. And so I actually want to show you quickly an example of what one of those looks like. And it was too hard to put it in a one slide. Oh God, it's so huge. No, oh my goodness. Okay, well, it's huge. There you go. Okay, so this is a run bundle from one of the runs that I did for running all of our models. And so what it shows you is it does a snapshot of the version of every piece of code that's being used on your machine. So I know the version of volcatinate. This is the version of sulfur X. This is the version of magic, this is a MATLAB code that there's a wrapper for in this. There's Evo, Wolfie, Vesical, gives you the timestamp, the Python version you're running, the models you ran, the compositions of every single one of the melts, and then the configuration. So this is all, here's a sneak peek behind the scenes of all of our model options. Here's Wolfie. It's a treasure chest. Here's Evo. Here's Magic. Here's Sulfur X. Yeah, yours is the longest. Here's decompress doesn't actually work right now, so it's nothing. Yeah, and then it tells you basically like what all the outputs are from the file, like the various files, and the resolved inputs, meaning like how it combined everything from like a CSV of compositions, and then what the model like took in before it ran its own model. So this is just a wrapper for these models. But yeah, see, this is a long file. So this is sort of like a peek at like the amount of information needed to be truly reproducible. So there you have it. If anyone has a solution, raise your hand. Yeah, I think that's my time. So thank you.
So, I think we've got time for a couple of questions, but then we need to move on to a broader discussion because I think we'll get rid of the coffee.
Yes.
There was a coffee break, but anyway.
This might be more.
Okay, do you want to hold that thought for like 1 minute?
Yeah, it's a broader question.
Any questions? Oh, yes?
I just wanted to say another thing we're planning on doing that didn't quite make it into this paper is just an easy to use guide for every single one of these models. So I basically met on Zoom with the author of every single model and was like, put this in line 67, or like, here's how to run decompress. So if you're trying to run these models not through this volcatinate, if you want them now, I can send them to you now. They are full of typos, but they will eventually be tidied up once I have some time.
Thank you. I think we're good. Thanks, Bill.
I think you have
Oh, sorry, Penny, I didn't see you there.
All of these models that you ran, are they all at one set temperature, or are you tanking temperature down as you compare them?
Oh, you have to turn yours off for me to turn mine. There we go. For these decompression ones, we kept them isothermal. We could have changed them, but that was one of the variables we decided to hold constant.
Do you think that so you mentioned FO2 being a problem, but I can imagine temperature might also influence these results and some of the differences you're seeing. Do you think, which one do you think is most important?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the temperature, insofar as the solubility part, probably not so much. But in terms of it's like, you know, when you calculate the FO2, depending on how you're calculating it, right? It's temperature dependent to go from the FO2 to a buffer equation, for example. It's also pressure dependent. Yeah. And a lot of people don't use a pressure term when they're calculating it. So a lot of literature has, you know, NNO, QFM to FO2 conversions at 1 bar, just hidden as a hidden assumption. And it can be okay for lower pressures, but at a couple GPA, like the QFM and the NNO buffers cross. Like QFM becomes more oxidizing than NNO. So yeah, I think the temperature problem is one of those things that's buried in there, and probably just making the FO2 problem worse.
Thanks, Kelly.
Yep.
How about we move to discussion?
Yep.
So we've got some, I can't quite remember, I think security was going to kick us out. So
We're leaving at half. There's an ice cream.
we are leaving at 4:30, okay?
Yeah,
So we will not go over time for that. So yeah, let's go into discussion now, broader. Go, Derek.
Okay, I have two points. So one is an advertisement. There is another model. It's called Petrolog. It's written by Lena Daniszewski. It's probably the best crystallization model. That's very accurate if you're within the range of experiments. But he's also recently put water, CO2, sulfur, sulfide, CO2, copper, nickel, apatite. It's become quite powerful. And I would say none of these models really deal with crystallization appropriately. And if you're dealing with wet systems, there is no way to degas water and not crystallize. So it's actually integral to the problem, and it drives major element changes, which also are not integrated. So I would plead with people, it's not as easy to use. You have to pay $70 for the license and run it on a PC. And I'm sorry, I can talk to you about why Leonid has this model. He actually doesn't have a job anymore, so he finds it very hard to donate his time for this, but he loves it, and if you reach out to him, he's happy to add things. But it's quite powerful and interesting, and I think it's worth looking at the comparison of what a combined degassing crystallization model will do. Because in particular, in arc magmas, it's, I think, really essential. So please, $70 is not that much. Take a look at Petrolog. Go ahead.
Can you just click your, just so we can, yep.
Oh yeah, this is related to this. And I guess Petrolog, like all of these tools, is just it uses existing models, right? So I think it's got sulfur X within Petrolog. So like you should be able to find out about the sulfur models within it.
Yeah, it has all the same. It has Dixon for water and CO2. It's got sulfur X. It actually can put others in. But the point is, it's integrated within changing temperature, changing FO2, changing melt composition with the crystallization model, which I just think is pretty vital, because they're not magmas degassing without anything else happening. So I think it's quite important to learn about that. Okay, my general comment was then how do we, what you guys have done is so great. I mean, years ago, there's no way. I mean, even at the last conference, right? So this is really tremendous, and I'm really appreciative of the work that you've done so that we can learn how these different models work. One gut feeling I have is that the main place that these really need work is at higher pressure than 4 kilobars. There's very few experiments above 500 MPa, and the higher and higher CO2 that we are finding in magmas is just pushing this higher and higher. And so I really feel like, the composition space might be important, but it's probably where are these models well tuned at high pressure that's really important. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who says, please, experimentalists, we need more experiments above, at a very hard place to do experiments, between 3 and 8 kilobars is tricky. And the other issue is FOGO is great, but come on, fuego is the most important composition. It is a garden variety basaltic andesite with 4% water, and it fails massively too. So, I think we need to understand that. This is where most of the volcanoes of the world are degassing that we need to understand. And it might just be the water and CO2 model again that needs some more work at high pressure. Hey, what do you guys think? You're the experts on this, so I'm opening this question up. For where do you think we need to really improve these models? Aside from getting our language correct, but what experiments do we need?
Erin, you go. And then I'll go to you.
I think one of the points brought up earlier about fluid composition, I think a real test of all these models is if we could have experimental fluid compositions to be able to actually say which models are reproducing the gas composition, and that would really help us know whether we're accurate or not. So I think you're right that higher pressure, but also if we could get vapor too. But as we discussed earlier, that's really hard. So.
I think for the sulfur stuff, a big difference between the models comes down to that sulfur 6+ over sulfur total ratio, and it's 2 things we need to do there. One is more Zane's measurements, but also better Zane's measurements. Anyone that's dug into Zane's recently for sulfur, there's basically 3 different ways you can reduce the data. And for Mauna Loa, that goes from 30% sulfur 6+ to 60% sulfur 6+. Then we obviously have all these different models to couple ion redox and sulfur, and that is what a lot of these models are doing differently. And that's why when you go, and Kayla showed that plot of the sulfur 6+ over sulfur total ratio, even for the ones that aren't using decompress, they are so different, and that is basically controlling when sulfur starts degassing. And Echo's model's great in that you can directly play with that parameter and just slightly tweaking the amount of sulfur 6+. It just massively depends when your sulfur comes out. So I think things like Lauren Gorojobski's recent paper with Bernie Wood, pushing that sulfur 6+ Fe3+ couple down to lower temperatures is fabulous, but I think we need even more of that to really tie at least that onset of sulfur degassing. I think that's one of the main parameters we could work on.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I would say that I would encourage you to play with the models and find out where they fall down, you know, and finding and hopefully we'll be able to implement something, you know, with this language, you know, building that language up, I think will help give us that tool to do that. So it's easy for you to say, find the problems there, right? For the systems you care about, like quantifying how well do they actually do, even though we have some good idea of it, we can show it with what's actually been done. But yeah, exploring that space a bit more, so.
Yeah, and I think that's the value of having a broad crowd in the audience, because we literally asked for experimentalists and modelists to come together, because I think it's not a one-way thing, so that the experimentalists feed into the modeling. There is this need to come back and forth. So it's exactly the point for what we tried to do even in 2023, to argue for more of those intermediate composition experiments, so that then that could be modelled in a more fruitful way. So this is exactly why we wanted to put this together, to try and get that community connection together. All right, anyone else? Is that okay, Terry? Yeah, anyone else? Do we need a coffee break with more chocolate? No?
I know that you have thoughts.
Shane?
Just a question to the room. How can those of us who mainly focus on natural rocks and measuring mass inclusions, fluid inclusions, whatever, how can we contribute to pushing things forward?
Yeah, go for it.
So I think, for instance, one example, with the measurements you made, for instance, if you do iron redox and sulfur redox and you have water and CO2, we can then start to compare whether our models reproduce those parts. So for instance, in most of the models, you can't specify FO2, sulfur, and iron redox, right? That's over-constrained. But if you have a measurement in a natural sample that has both iron and sulfur stains, if we can check our models and see if they actually reproduce it, for instance. So those kind of things do allow us to like tweak whether they're matching what real data is showing.
Right, so comprehensive data sets essentially, and combining as many methods as possible.
I think as well, just like talking to the model authors. So when we did this comparison with decompress, I was able to say to Elaine, like, you are predicting 90% sulfur 6+ in kiloware, and I know that isn't right. The answer is 20%, and that allowed us to work out kind of what was wrong. The moment I told him that, he was like, oh, I can work out why that is. But until you've like found all these things that you've verified in natural systems, he didn't know that was a problem because he hasn't run it on every composition in the world and doesn't have all the background knowledge we know. So I think a lot of it is just, as Ari said, like, you have natural constraints. Once you realize it's wrong, don't just say, oh, it's wrong. Go to the model author and be like, hey, why is this wrong? And very often they will know why it's wrong. And that's really helpful to know as well.
And I'll just say too, part of it, you know, I'm like just preaching the open source ecosystem, it's apparently my job. Having something in place, right, where you can, because this is what we do, and what we should do is be contacting each other, but sometimes that becomes difficult, especially when people leave the field for whatever reason, or the code doesn't run anymore because it's on an outdated system. But if you write a code and it's on a GitHub, you know, so any one of these models that are on GitHub, you can go and for the computer science, more literate people probably have done this, you can do something called a pull request. So you can copy that repo over to your own sort of workspace, make whatever edits you want, and then go back to the original author. This is all within like the GitHub or GitLab platform, and do a pull request that's saying, hey, I made these edits to your code. Here's an explanation of what I did, and then they can review it. And they can say, oh, actually, you didn't do this right, it broke something else. Or they can say, this is great, I'm merging it into the code. So you can contribute to stuff that's out there already. And this is one thing we really want to enable. You know, Mark Iorso, who wrote the original MELTS algorithms, will be the first person to tell you that if you want to add something to MELTS, you have to call Mark and say, can you please add my experiments to MELTS? And so there's a lot of people, like his group included, that are trying to make it so you don't have to do that anymore. And that's how our stuff is going to live, you know, longer than we do. So. I also want to hear from the group though. I don't want this to necessarily be a one-way street. So like, are there things that we didn't address that you were like, oh, well, I wish you had talked about this? Or are there things, your systems that you care about that you think should be in this, community more? Yeah.
Covered everything.
You need a t-shirt cannon or something?
Yeah, I think we do. I think, yeah.
Throw candy at you?
Yes, here we go. Good.
Hey!
These were some of the things you wrote in the comment. I asked what are you interested in, whatever. So these are some of the ones that I just picked out, that came up a few times that maybe we weren't covering, or we maybe didn't cover enough potentially. So these might be a
Well, so, I do a lot of work with hydrogen and sulfur isotopes, and so I was wondering if people have plans to start incorporating those with Wolfie or vesicle, etc.
Did you want to mention stuff in Sulfur X?
Yeah, so it's actually in sulfur X. I think Wolfie also has it. So it can calculate the sulfur isotope fractionation along degassing. You just need to input your initial delta 34 value. It will calculate the gas and also the magma.
And I'm giving a talk at 4 p.m. on Friday.
Oh.
That shows, giving a talk at 4 p.m. on Friday, if anyone is still here, that shows that the Sulfur X model actually does a very nice job going through our new melt inclusion data set that are sulfur isotopes and melt inclusions over degassing paths of 12 different volcanoes. It's really quite impressive that it works with these old fractionation factors. So, but it's in Zoltan Taranchak's paper coming out, if you missed my pitch of that. But I don't know about hydrogen isotopes.
I've got.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Wolfie has carbon, hydrogen, and sulfur in it. But the point is actually once you have the melt vapor proportions and you have the speciation of the melt, actually it's not as hard a problem as getting the degassing curves because it's just a mass balance issue. So that makes it actually isotopes should be much easier. And so for instance, the way I've done it in Wolfie is you could in theory upload a different degassing model result, and if you know the proportions of everything, it should work. So, but it depends on the isotope fractionation factors. And so some of the moves are well constrained, some of those are less well constrained. There aren't actually that many constraints on the sulfur isotopic fractionation. It's cool that then they look like they're doing well. So,
John.
So this is something maybe you're doing already, but it would be very interesting, maybe amazing, to have a point group or person at certain observatories who are using your codes in real time before and when a crisis is happening to help their assessment of what's going on. So maybe you could comment about that.
Did you, since you...
No, I was going to say that Erie was our point contact and then she left, so, yeah.
still around.
No, I think this is a super crucial thing. I think the work, I feel like, we could probably start those conversations now, and it's probably, at the beginning of any project, you want to make sure that the side you're supposedly making something for actually you're doing what they actually need, right? So asking that question, I think, is the first step. I do think there is also a burden on us from the academic side to first sort of make clearer the mess that is our own work. So having done at least this exercise, and having sort of unearthed this issue with using decompressed frequency, for example, I think we're absolutely at the point where that should happen. I don't know the best way to do it, but I think it should be done, yeah.
I can just make one quick comment. I think the trends in research funding are pointing towards more impact. And I think this is a substantially huge potential here to generate significant impact. So if some research could be done, let's say there's some experiments that can be done on a given volcano, and then some solubility model could be tailored almost exactly to that volcano, and then deployed in some sort of dashboard for the volcano observatory to utilize, then you're showing the research that's actually feeding into direct impact, effectively saving lives. So I think any way in which we can encourage that from an observatory position, which I work at, then I think we would be more than keen to work with anyone who wants to support that endeavour. And I think, unfortunately, I think from my experience, there's probably not enough of a connection as people would say that they should be doing. So I think in academia we can often do things in relative isolation, but I think there's significant, just a connecting of a few dots, and then you have massive impact. So that would be my pledge and my hope, that the academic community could actually engage more with the observatories to actually develop that impact.
And to continue along these great thoughts, it might be good to identify those systems that might show a sense of magma in the next few years. I mean, there's some systems out there that are really fragile in terms of what might happen in the future, and two places come to mind: Campi Flegrei, of course, and also Martinique, where magma could possibly rise to very shallow levels and maybe erupt. And so to identify those 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 places where your models could be applied in real time, that would be amazing.
Yes, Penny.
I don't want to talk for too long because I'm sort of adjacent to this community, but one of the things I've noticed with the climate community is that they have this responsibility that they're delivering on, and I think for volcanology to have impact in the same way that they're doing things, they've said we have the high pathway and the low pathway for CO2 emissions, and we have the CSIRO model, the East Anglia model, the blah, blah, blah model for climate temperature changes with CO2. And so they've bracketed their ranges using a range of different models to reduce the risk of them, getting something in their systems wrong. And I think that me looking at this from the outside, the risk is most of these models are the magma, but some of what is getting measured is the gas, and there's a pathway of this expanding gas going through the rocks, gas reacting with gas reacting with rocks, and the hydrothermal system. And we had one talk on the hydrothermal system, but I haven't seen how that's integrated into the gas measurements and what's being done here. And so if there was an area to expand upon, that's a pun. That's where I go.
I'll just quickly jump on that to say, I think that's a really excellent point and a really good way of thinking about that. I think another thing that we should be talking about as a community up to that point is less about necessarily the precision of, or to some degree even accuracy of a particular model for a particular eruption. Because to assess hazard, you don't necessarily need the answer. You need some bracket to make an informed decision. And so there's some exercises that I've done in the past, given talks about in the past about how we might just do this using carbon and SO2 ratios, and just figuring out which of those are magmatically implausible and sort of rejecting them and trying to come up with seeing where the gas is coming from. And it's crude, but it was very effective and it matched the data that we had seen. So I think taking a bracketing approach is something we should also consider as valuable, not just like, do the data from these specific rocks fall along this specific curve, but like, what can we actually do with it from there? Do we, how precise do we need to be to answer the questions that we're asking, I guess?
Yeah, this is related, I guess, another thought with what John was asking, and Penny and Kayla, that I think the CO2 sulfur ratio of the gas is probably the most useful monitoring tool that we have in real time with multi-gas instruments. And I think the scariest figure from your comparison were the ratios of the gases.
Yeah.
They were hugely different and surprising. You know, the melts actually look like they agree pretty well with the CO2 degassing and the sulfur degassing, but you just need tiny differences to have a complete difference in the gas ratio.
Yeah.
Like if you're only degassing CO2 and you're barely degassing sulfur, the ratio is like infinity for the CO2 sulfur.
Yeah.
So I think that's a piece of this where it'd be really useful that I hope some people write a proposal, you know, and get some new experiments, because this is a really critical place where we can make a difference. And right now, we need to understand why the models are so different.
Just on the carbon sulfur ratio, you're asking Shane about measurements. I ran some models for Fakari to see what carbon sulfur ratios are at what depth, and FO2 is the biggest. I mean, that's within a single model. I can get whatever carbon sulfur ratio I like, depending on an FO2 range, which was reasonable for Fakari because we don't have great constraints. So I think constraining important systems where we think this might be useful is also part of the natural measurements.
You guys just showed the same FO2, you get completely different results.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, so I'm saying this is an additional.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly add that just the compounding effect of these two things is that too, like the way the measurements are made. So we had a few talks talking about how different measurements are made, and if you're measuring SO2, you're not measuring SO2 total. You're not measuring S as SO2 total. You're measuring SO2. H2S is a different electrochemical sensor. So if you're not measuring H2S, you're not getting the total sulfur. You're getting the SO2 to CO2 ratio. And if the SO2 to H2S ratio is different in a different model, then that C to S ratio, which is not S total, is going to be super different. So that's just in addition to the depth of degassing and the FO2 and the uncertainties we have in terms of how to talk about FO2, I think is compounding that.
Okay.
Do any of the models include sulfur disproportionation?
Not the degassing ones.
In sulfur?
Yeah, so SO2 plus.
The hydrothermal ones.
Yeah, the hydrothermal ones should. So SO2 plus.
I'm not sure if the magnetic gas.
But I mean, that's another way of changing the redox.
Okay.
I think the other elephant in the room is that some of these models track sulfide saturation, but they do not account for the fact that your sulfides will start to dissolve and your sulfates will start to dissolve, and that is going to be a whole another problem. Terry, do you know, does Petrolog 4 solve that problem? Does it just track sulfide and sulfate like echoes like in the background, or does it actually integrate it into the three-phase partitioning?
I think it integrates it into the partitioning. I think it's a fully sulfide saturated model wrapped in there. Again, Landon's original interest was nickel and copper and things like that, but I think you could do a lot of things. You could do recharge and remelt it. I'm pretty sure it's powerfully done. Is that right, Echo?
I'll just say that the models that we ran, for any of the models that had the option to, we turned off sulfur crystallization. Some of them had option for graphite crystallization. We turned all of that off for consistency. So that would have been another layer of craziness.
Okay, so we are done. We're at time. And I just wanted to thank the people who really did the massive amount of lifting for getting this workshop together. So that's Erin, Penny, Kayla, Echo, John for being our local contact, and Victor. Tom, easily, Tom, thanks for doing this, and he's about to hand in his thesis, so crazy effort. But thanks everyone.
In terms of, we're going to head over to the Goldschmidt, it's called Icebreaker. We will